Welcome to a Here and Now and On the Go co-production. We're going to be talking about matters pertaining to race for the next hour and a bit. There's a new business in town called Race to Dinner. This is more of a lunch to dinner. We've invited several CBC viewers and listeners to meet with two facilitators who are going to talk about race. No issue is off the table. None of this has been rehearsed. So let's see what happens.
So I want to first thank all of you for choosing to come to this. This isn't something that a lot of people volunteer themselves to be vulnerable. So the first question we have for you guys is, do you think racism truly exists within Newfoundland and Labrador? If so, how does it show up? And I'm going to start with George.
I'm sure it's there.
Okay.
I have not personally witnessed it, but I have witnessed racism in other places, particularly the U.S. I've even been the subject of reverse racism in the U.S.
Okay.
But in Newfoundland, I think, well, we're coming up into our own in a lot of things. I guess racism will follow.
Susan.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And again, as a white person, I don't see racism against me.
Okay.
Okay. But certainly discrimination.
Yeah.
I have seen multiple instances of discrimination, not towards me, but towards some of my junior colleagues who have come from away.
Anne?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. And how do you feel it shows up?
To me, I think it starts at the very top. I mean, we see the exploitation of Indigenous territories, first of all. Beyond that, I think, yes, there are definitely racist ideas that are running around the community. And they're not born of malice. They're born, I believe, of just not really understanding a lot of the history and the nuance. You know, just things like what privilege means.
Yeah.
And I think, too, that it is an educational process. I think we've all been infected by this white supremacy thing. I mean, even some people of color are, because we read about internalized racism, right? So it's like in the ether. So I believe it's an ongoing, probably lifelong work for people to I don't know that there's ever a time when you can say, well, I've got that done, you know, because
No.
it's so deeply embedded in the fabric of our world.
So I know when we started talking, people mentioned a couple terms that other people might not have heard about or fully understand. So when you talked about, one, we're going to talk a little bit about, George, what you said about reverse racism as to whether or not that actually exists within, not to say that your experiences weren't valid in terms of discrimination, but whether it was reverse racism. So, and Anne, you were talking about white supremacy and what that actually is. So I would like for people to understand what white supremacy is. White supremacy is the fact that white culture is the overarching thing in everything we do. It is the standard to which everything else is measured. So when people talk about standards of beauty, it is a white standard to which every other beauty is measured to. It's white culture to which every other culture, white education standards to which everything else is measured. So that's what, when people say white supremacy, it's not always when people are thinking the KKK with the hoods and the cursors burning in the night. That is an example of white supremacy, but white supremacy is that the white culture is the ruling culture. Now, George, you explained that you might have experienced what you would like to call reverse racism.
Yeah.
Can you explain what the situation was so we can unpack that?
Being a teacher, we travel all the time,
Yeah.
especially all summers, and we frequently went to the U.S. Sometimes you would go into a store and you pick up some stuff, you go to the counter, and the lady be a young lady of color, and I'd lay my stuff on the counter, and then you got your stuff paid, and you paid and walked out. But then in the meantime, you came in and stood there. So when it was time, I figured it was time for my turn, you got served. And a couple of times I said, excuse me, I'm next.
Yep.
You know, not because I'm white, but I'm next.
Yes, you were next. So I can account of that as being an issue of discrimination, but when we talk about racism, we need to understand the idea of racism, there's power in racism. So,
well, I guess you could say she had the power to serve the next person.
Yes, but I mean, the idea of racism is there's power in your race. So when we talk about racism, the discrimination of people of other races, it's that the overarching race has institutionalized power.
That's the closest I ever came.
Okay, so yes, you experienced discrimination. Absolutely, I will say that you could have experienced discrimination in that situation. It wouldn't be reverse racism, because racism is rooted in power in your race.
I still learned something already.
I'm glad to hear. So that it's important. So like when we talk to other people outside of this, they could have been discriminated against, and there's no way for us to say no, you can't be discriminated against because you're some of another race. People get discriminated against for a variety of reasons, race being one of them, ethnicity, we have disabilities, we have there are a multitude of reasons. But racism would not be the correct thing, because it doesn't happen in reverse, because people of color do not usually have enough power in institutions to inflict the kind of damage that would be categorized under racism.
I've had no experience with racism. I grew up in and went to school, nothing taught all my life, no experience with racism.
And that is where we get to white privilege. White privilege, for people who don't understand, isn't that you've been handed things because you're white. That because you're white, you haven't had to deal with things. Your race has never been the deciding factor in anything that you have felt with negatively. Any of the negative things that have happened in your life are not directly attributed to your race. So that's a privilege in existing in a white supremacist world, which is what we generally live in right now.
To me, I'm thinking sometimes of race. Is that the real issue, or is it the power?
So that's a hard one. So,
because if you go somewhere else,
yeah.
And I've traveled a little bit, and I've gone to countries where nobody looks like me.
Yeah.
And it's quite the eye-opening experience, let me tell you. And there is some degree of racism because I'm not of the dominant culture, and I'm not. So is it racism isn't just a black thing?
No,
is it?
racism is a people of color thing.
Okay.
So many different races experience racism. It's not just black, it's not just indigenous people, it's not just people who are Southeast Asian and any of that. It's something that's experienced by people of color. Now, when people who are white travel to non-white countries, they do stand out. They do get discriminated against because of the fact that their white culture is overarching, and usually when they're in these spaces, it's an idea that they need to be accepted immediately, not understanding that they have for a long time been marginalizing racialized people, even in their own countries. So when white people travel, white people travel pretty carefree. You go on and you're generally going to be safe in the area. You're generally going to have things that are accommodated to fit you. You'll find things that you want, things that you need. That doesn't apply to racialized folks when we're traveling in any extent of the world, except we're traveling within areas that are made to fit just for us.
Yeah. I mean, I've never had to worry that if I go somewhere and I rent a car, I'm going to be pulled over just because of who I am.
Exactly.
Right? And I've never had to have a conversation with my son about, if you get pulled over, these are the things that you absolutely don't do. I mean, I have, but not in the same way that if my son was black.
No.
That would be a whole different kettle of fish.
It's not in the same way I'm prepping to have conversations with my son as he grows. It's not in the same way my parents have had conversations with my brothers. It's not in the same way my parents have had conversations with me. I would existing as a black woman in a white world. So these are things that when we talk about white supremacy and white privilege, these are things that white people get to exist without having to think about having to go through or having to even worry about in their existence. So do we understand what systemic racism is?
Yeah.
Okay. And then for other people, it means it's embedded into the system. It is, without thinking, it's just the way things run and the way they've run since the institution of the system, since the system has started. It's been created in a way that white people are typically provided for, cared for. Usually, white men are typically at the helm of the power, and it's usually catered to ensure that your safety and your importance is protected.
I never knew that for all my life.
And that's something that a lot of white men don't think about. So the system was built by you, for you, to preserve you.
And it's done a good job.
And it's done a fantastic job of preserving for you.
Yeah.
And then when we look at systems, it typically goes white men, white women, and then racialized folk, with black people usually falling at the bottom because anti-black racism is in every culture. It exists in every ethnicity, in every racialized. There's just due to white supremacy, there's this written off that black is bad and darkness is bad and all of that is bad. So in every race and ethnicity, if you're of the darker part, you are automatically sidelined. So it's important that when we talk about race and racism, racism exists and within a lot of different cultures, and it's usually anti-black. So that's a sentiment that runs through a lot of things.
Even our language.
Yes.
Even our language. Because, you know, who's wearing the black hat? The bad guy.
Yep.
Right? I mean, those kinds of things are so woven into our culture. We don't even see them.
No.
And he rides the white, a good guy rides
the white horse. Right? And so, you know,
Yeah.
I really think that that's part of the work that has to be done, and not just work by you, because
Absolutely.
I think oftentimes as white people, we kind of think that we'll have the black people teach us. Like, we'll just put that work on you to teach us, and that's kind of what we're doing here in some ways. And
Yes.
we have to take more ownership. But when you live a certain way and you've got the blinders on and you're doing your thing and you don't think you're causing harm, you really do need somebody to come and say, now hang on here.
But
Did you the statement you just made, do you know where that comes from?
You can have a little epiphany. So I was in a situation very much like this, spread of food, in a kind of staff coffee room situation. And one of the people who worked with us was a man from Africa. And he was also like a sugar maniac. I was trying to relate to him, don't eat the last cookie. And, oh God. As he was reaching, he was teasing me, and as he reached for those cookies, I opened my mouth and I said, take your cotton picking hands. Exactly. As a Newfoundlander, growing up by American Westerns, I never for a minute, like, in that moment too, as the words were coming out of my mouth, it downloaded, right? Oh. Yeah. But that can happen because, like I said, it is in the ether.
And so much of our lives are these things. They're little tiny building blocks that you've had from infancy. You know, the songs that were sung to you, the stories that were read, where you went to school, like all these little things, all the shows you watched on television, and these subliminal messages, right? And this all has created who we are today, and we are so unaware, I think, of most of this. So, help. Because I think we have to undo some of this.
Yep. So
Because the world is different, and it has to be different.
absolutely. So
And I guess that's where education comes in. I mean, you look down at the States and you see Florida, and they're getting rid of critical race theory. They think it's bad, and it does come from a level of ignorance in a way, and that the misunderstanding is there.
there was a homework assignment that was released last year. And that was social studies where students were they were basically told how to prevent immigration. And the end of it is like, why should people not come here? And they were given the task of preventing racialized people moving to Newfoundland and Labrador. And it hit the media because parents were handed, you have racialized students coming home with their homework being like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to prevent me coming here?
But can I just...
Yeah.
I have a tendency to play devil's advocate.
Play away because it's important.
Because I think to really explore an issue, you have to look at a lot of different sides of it. And particularly in universities, where our job as university profs is to challenge people and challenge the ideas that they hold, challenge their worldview, create or help students create an open mind.
Yeah.
Okay? That sometimes you have to, in some ways, present uncomfortable issues and say, what do you think?
So there's presenting uncomfortable issues,
Yeah.
but you need to have a system that's prepared to address it. And our current system is not prepared to address discomfort like that. There isn't enough of representation of racialized people in the system for them to see the other side. They do not see enough of the good that racialized people, they're not presented with enough of the good that racialized people contribute to our particular province. So if you're continuing to give them say why they shouldn't be here when they're continuously bombarded with why people shouldn't be here, they're just continuing to further
Gotcha.
instill that idea.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
that's what we have with that situation. So when we talked a little bit about what you and we're talking about unlearning, basically noticing that there are things going on. So I have a question. So we're all adults. We've all been in situations that are slightly uncomfortable. What is your typical reaction when you are in a predominantly white space and someone says something that is either outlandishly racist or even just like a microaggression? And by microaggression, I mean it's not calling someone the N-word out there, but it's like saying, oh, those people over there, they do that. Or, oh, yes, because they're Asian, they have to be smarter in doing that. How do you guys handle that?
That's actually, I'm really glad you opened this up, because my impulse, especially if it's like, the more overt and outrageous it is, the stronger the impulse to like, right?
Yeah.
So there's that piece, but I also feel like there's a tension between stepping up as a visible ally, right? And swooping in as a white messiah.
Yeah.
And like hijacking that situation away from the person who it's happening to. It's a tension, and I'm never quite sure what's appropriate and what's not. So thank you for opening that.
That's really true. Because I've been in situations where, like, do I say something? Or
Yeah.
just let it go.
And I find it more so because I did witness an outrageously racist microaggression against a black man. I was standing right there, and he actually turned and we kind of, did you see that? And I think just men in general, I would be, and this is probably sexist, but I would be a little more reluctant if the object of the hostility was a man, because for some men that's an additional kind of offensive thing. I don't need your help. So yeah, it can be tricky, I think.
I struggle with that as well, because you don't want to come across, you want to call attention to things and teach people, or if you hear somebody saying really something quite egregious, I mean, that has to stop. Just has to stop. But then, as a white woman, is that my place to say something? Am I being helpful, or am I exerting my power?
So
Right?
So I have
What do you think?
an opinion on that is when you're watching someone be attacked racially or being discriminated against racially, why is it on me to continually defend myself all the time? You are sitting in a situation where we're not asking you to educate the person on my race or my ethnicity, on why I deserve rights. It's your chance to step up. And the easiest way I explain it is we've all been in school where we've attended those anti-bullying campaigns, right? We all sat on the floor of the gym and we had the person talk to us like, were you a bully? And everyone puts their hand up and said, no, I wasn't a bully. And the next question is, were you a bystander? And everyone sits there. And what did you do? You did nothing. So when you do nothing and you wait for the racialized person or the victim to defend themselves, you're creating a situation where they already don't have power.
And like when you're sitting there and it's happening, and then especially if there's other people around and you're looking, and like for me, I usually end up making eye contact with somebody, and it's just so awkward, and then it lingers because it's like, even while it's happening, everybody's looking, but nobody's saying anything. And I would rather
Anybody at this point.
Yes, and you know what I mean. And so yeah, it is, but just anti-bullying.
It is.
So
It's
just, anyway.
It's the easiest way to not dumb it down, but to simplify it to its very extent. If you're in a situation, leaving the victim of the attack to continuously defend themselves and say, "Someone help me," it doesn't help them. They're already in a stress situation. They're already out of their element. They're already being targeted. When you're sitting there with all this power to put an end to a situation.
That's good to know. So what about those situations where, I mean, there are times when it's pretty obvious, okay? And we can all step up with that. But there are a lot of times when it's really subtle and you're sitting there and you're going, it's like the 5 minute later you're going, did I hear what I thought I heard? What, oh, was that what I thought it was? Like, what do I, then you're, because
You go
those,
back.
okay.
You go back, because if it doesn't need to be fixed, if you can't fix it in the instant, but you've had that minute and you have a way to contact the person that said the thing or did the thing, you go back, because for as long as you let them continue to wander in society with the belief that that was okay.
Yes, exactly. Telling them to knock it off, whatever they're doing, and then, you know, hopefully, maybe the next time, like, oh, wait, I remember, you know, that was wrong, and so I feel like they're less likely to repeat that behavior if you call it out.
Exactly. So if whether you call it out in the time or if you need to figure out
Later,
how to do it,
go talk to them later.
but you do need to call it out, because then they continue to exist in society and think that was okay. No one had an issue with that. It only offended the person that it was intended to offend or hurt. So I'm okay. I've sat with my peers, and my peers didn't have an issue with it. So it's clearly you're continuing to build environments where racism gets to thrive and where discrimination gets to excel, and it snowballs out there because people tend to get bolder. If I said this little thing and no one had an issue, or people thought it was a joke and they laughed, maybe I'll say it more, or I'll say something bigger just to see how far I can push it before someone says there's an issue with it.
And, you know, people, if one person gets up and says, stop that, usually there's a trickle effect. Then it's like, oh, okay. And then other people will come in and say something. And even if it's just a small stop and then they go on the receiving end of that hostility, and when someone steps in and, I mean, the first thing I'm going to think about, you know, depending on what's going on is, well, oh, thank goodness. Like, I've been relieved of that, and that makes me feel like, okay, this space is a safe space, like a safer space, and I don't know, it just, like, it makes me feel more welcome and at ease. I mean, of course, you know, nobody wants to be bullied, and
So that's what you're trying to do, because imagine if you were in that situation, would you want someone to step up, or do you want to feel like you have to defend yourself against someone that's already coming down your throat?
What if you observe something that, like, for sure is an issue?
Yeah.
For example, a person of color being denied, let's say, access to a taxi. And it's
they don't unlock their door.
Yeah, they don't.
No,
they
no.
don't unlock
So-
their door.
okay,
Yes,
so-
they do not. They will lock it as you approach said counter.
Yeah. So
Yes,
that
seriously.
actually was the situation I was talking about. Like, it happened really fast. But even when I went home, because I used that particular cab company a lot, this is what I struggled with as well, is like, should I call the cab company? And then it was like, those drivers all know if this guy gets a cab from them a lot, like where he lives. I didn't, like, sometimes I find it difficult to know whether intervention will make a bad situation, will cause more exposure to harm. Like, in that case, I really wondered if it would.
So
And that's, like, you can't be a prophet. I guess you don't have a crystal ball. You can't tell in that particular situation. But it is kind of, I think it has to be considered that black people are more vulnerable to violence. I don't know.
So you need
help.
you need to be willing to stick your neck out in that situation. If you're calling to report something that you saw, be willing to put your name down, because if you leave that level of anonymity, they're going to think it's us reporting, and then you continue to expose us.
I was afraid they would retaliate against him.
If you make a report, it is between you and the cab company and the owner to create a situation that doesn't endanger the person.
Gotcha.
So if you're going to make a report, you need to advocate then on that person's behalf to ensure their safety. So you feel like, hey, maybe don't go back to that cab driver and say, open your door to black people and let them in your cab. But maybe you and talk to them like, your organization needs anti-racism training, because you're creating situations where racialized people are being left vulnerable and you're putting them in danger.
This is the education part, is because people like me who haven't had that experience, when you say you saw that, I'm thinking, what? Like, what idiot would close the door on a cat? Like, who would do that? And I know it happens, like intellectually I know it happens, but it hasn't been part of my experience. So I guess maybe what I'm thinking is that we really need to hear more of this stuff because it's so hidden.
I think people just don't know.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Especially
People
with a place like
people don't
Newfoundland.
know.
There's a different history. It's not like I'm from the southern United States. It's different. It's in the air, kind of. It's a different kind of thing. And you come up here, and like think of all the outport towns and the smaller people just don't know.
For racialized people, there's a point in telling our story, yes, and sometimes we don't mind doing it. But there's a lot of trauma in reliving a moment that has happened to you. And putting there are people, like I don't mind telling racist things that have happened to me to a certain extent. There are times where I'm just like, I don't want to talk about it because it puts me in a situation where I have to be vulnerable again to something bad that happened to me. But there are a lot of other experiences that exist. Like the idea of racism and people being discriminated against isn't new. We know, intellectually we know it's there. But if we're not actively doing something to prevent it, that onus of I've never seen it, so I don't have to do anything about it,
exactly.
doesn't fly anymore. We can't continue to be reactive to racism. We need to be proactive because if we then proactive, we don't put people in harm's way. Waiting for someone to get hurt before we help them, you're going to have a lot more people hurt before we get to a solution.
When I was growing up, the real push was on to be colorblind.
Oh, sweet heavenly.
Right? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that you're too young for that, maybe.
No, it's
But-
still a push to be colorblind.
And so, can you really articulate for me where the downfalls? Because I know, and I've heard that that's really bad.
It is. But why?
But why and how do somebody like me
Do you want to
work on that?
Oh no, I'm gonna just start, and then you can get it. You've got the words. I feel like it kind of it's an erasure.
Yes.
And like it's like, okay, well, you know what? I'm not gonna see any color, and for everybody, and it just kind of, especially with the uniqueness that anti-black racism is, that like it takes away from, I think, really working on that issue. That's all I got.
You can see pink, you can see blue, you can see brown and yellows and the colors of the rainbow. And you get to call those beautiful, right? The minute you say you're colorblind, you erase any of the beauty in the experiences of being black, in any of the beauty of the experiences of being indigenous or being Asian, because you don't see our color. There is so much of our personalities and of who we are that resides in our race. We have other things that make up who we are as well, but there's a lot of the way we see the world is based on our race. So if you don't see our race, you don't get the full grasp as to how we are navigating society, how we're navigating our workplaces, our schools, just our existence. So you get to live in a world where part of who we are ceases to exist. The same way if you're a woman, you identify as a woman, if I completely said you had no gender, does that erase how you experience things? There are things you get to experience in the way you navigate because you're a woman that are now taken away from you because I said I don't see your gender.
Yeah, I think my understanding as growing up was that the purpose of that was not so much erasure, but equality.
I understand the
you know,
intent.
that's-
The intent
But
was
there's a
there,
better
but
That's what the
way.
intent was.
we need to open our eyes and take the blinders off, which being colorblind doesn't do. It erases the things that we need to address in order to move forward.
Yeah.
Racism just wasn't an issue
Racism wasn't an issue
for
for
me.
you.
That's right. I'm not saying it wasn't an issue, but I never saw it and I never experienced it.
I know for sure Chinese people who've been living here for well over a century, quite established here, still experience racism here, even though their families have been here. Well, it wouldn't even matter, but they will tell you their families have been in this culture and in this place for generations, and will still get harassed with like racist language and stuff. For sure, Indigenous people, like I know many people who are Mi'kmaq, who discovered they were Mi'kmaq in their adolescence or early adulthood because somewhere along the line it became dangerous in Newfoundland and Labrador to disclose. All this stuff happened here too. It's just that it wasn't on the front page of the Daily News or the Evening Telegram, and nobody questioned it.
There was a family friend, and they were talking with all the other family friends, and I was here, and everybody was predominantly white, and the saucy as the black came out, and then everybody went,
And they looked at you.
and so, but I was like, what even is that?
You could use that
I've
phrase.
never heard of it.
I've heard two different things about that, and I don't know which one is correct. The first one is the one that we're all kind of assuming. The other one is that it's a reference to Black Irish, which are Spanish Irish. Ireland was colonized at one point by Spain, so I'm not sure which it is. It probably could be both.
Either way, it's
Either way,
not a
yeah,
great
it's
one.
racist either way.
My experience is that you could use that expression against you if you were being teasing and being,
Yes, so-
I could say, you're saucy black.
So here's where
Obviously you're not, so you know what that means, but still.
Here's where the issue actually lies in that sentiment. It's the idea. So when you're saying she's saucy as a black, that's not a compliment in any.
Well, in the context, it might be just a flippant comment.
Yes, but was it a compliment? Were you complimenting? Was that something that was said as a praise to someone?
Isn't that when someone's messing around or they're saying something that it's
When
not
someone's being-
you're not gonna be,
when you're saucy.
Spicy and provocative.
Yes, but it was never something that was said. It's not. It wouldn't be the equivalent to, oh, you're highly educated, or you're smart, or you're beautiful, or any of that. It wasn't a compliment.
You know what it is? It's like black hat.
Yes.
And there you go.
It's
the colors.
exactly.
It's negative.
It's
undertone.
a negative, derogatory comment. So when we talk about when do you do something about a microaggression or a racist interaction, it's then. Your issue then becomes with the person who made the comment, and it's in order to create a situation where that isn't said again to someone else. You'd be like, hey, have we thought about where this statement came from for a minute? Have we thought about the history behind the statement, the intended impact of that original phrase? If the person's like, no, it's just something we said, well, let's take a second, see why it's not okay to say things like that. Let's look at the history of our verbiage, our wording, and why these statements came to be, and say that you could say this in a situation that does real harm to someone else. Because maybe she didn't react outwardly, because just because she doesn't immediately seem uncomfortable doesn't mean she's not going home later and being, that really sucked. That really, really sucked. And for racialized people, there's a tendency to just nip it.
Yes. And of course, depending on who you're talking to, there's different ways to call a thing out.
Yeah.
If I'm at work, I'm going to have a formal conversation. If I'm dealing with an uncle who I haven't seen in forever and, we're around a fire and that kind of stuff, maybe the approach starts, like, oh, wow, I haven't heard that said in a while, and then you kind of get into it that way instead of saying, that's a bad thing.
Exactly.
Right, so there's a different way, like maybe it's a more humorous approach. You kind of got to know your audience too, right?
But the things you do something, because doing nothing means it happens again.
And they just don't know.
Exactly.
So, it's just, now they know.
It seems to me that most sort of racism in the community, like in social situations and things like that, doesn't appear to be malicious to me. Most of the time, it just appears to be like my cotton picking hands. I just didn't know. But I do think that that's why I'm asking if you experience this. I do feel like there may be a bit of, in Newfoundland and Labrador right now, bit of, not resentment exactly, but like an anxiety about the fact that the pool of opportunities right now has a much bigger applicant kind of situation. The competition, competitive field is changing, right?
Yeah.
And also, like when we want to correct any kind of marginalization, one way that we do it, especially if we want to like hasten the process, which could take generations otherwise, we may want to overcorrect a bit, right? So we might want to create more opportunities for a person of color or a disabled person or whatever the group is. And people not understanding that can resent it because they feel like something's being taken from them, when in fact we've been taking it all along. Like, we're actually giving it back.
That's really
Right?
true. That's really true.
I believe it is true. I believe that whatever we call this thing, this buzz, right? I think that it's an anxiety that you're going to lose a little privilege.
That's exactly it. You're gonna lose a little
Yeah.
privilege.
Something to
'cause-
change, yeah.
And I'm not gonna say I understand, because that doesn't mean I agree with it, but I recognize how that can be uncomfortable. When you've always had something, you tend to think it's yours now. You tend to take ownership over it and think, I deserve it. It's been mine for 5, 10 generations. I've always had this right. You tend to think it's a right of yours. Wasn't a right. It was something generations ago you took.
Yeah.
And it's now being like, hey, just in case you didn't realize, you didn't have ownership of this. So now let's make it an equal playing field. And so when equality and equity is presented when you've been a dominator, it feels like something is being taken from you.
Yeah.
It's not. You're just being presented with the fact that you didn't have the onus of this and you don't deserve to continue to monopolize the situation. And that's uncomfortable. And people just need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
The more you talk about it, the more I start to think, how often have I stood up? And I know I have. I know I have stood up. And I also know there's been times when I haven't stood up. And that's on me to do a better job. But I think the main thing that I really try to do is I come to something like this. I have open conversations when I can. I talk to my students a lot about not just race, but there's gender issues, and there's sexuality issues, and there's poverty versus rich, and I try to spend every time when I'm with somebody, in my world it's patients, trying to very hard. I'm doing the role that I was trained to do, here's your drugs and here's your physical exam and whatever. But also at the same time trying to be respectful and responsive to them as an individual, not necessarily, and to figure out what it is right for them, not necessarily for their gender or for where they're from or the color of their skin, but for them. Maybe that's the wrong approach. I don't know.
I won't say it's the wrong approach. But all I'm saying is that when you're doing what's right for them, make sure that you acknowledge what all of them is.
Yeah.
And that we don't narrow it them to their gender or any of that. Think of them as a whole person.
Yeah.
And ask.
I learned a lot here.
That's good.
So that white middle-class male,
That's the epitome of power, sir.
yeah, you made me realize a lot about that. Things that never occurred to me because it's just the way it was. Like, I've never attended a university course and wondered if you were going to be prejudiced against me if I was in your, because I was white. And I'm sorry, you weren't. But I'm sure if I was black, and that might be a consideration.
It is a consideration. Absolutely. It's a consideration walking into any non-math course. Any non-based math course that has to deal with humanities in any extent is to wonder is what version of me are you going to profile?
Yeah.
And is it going to be welcoming?
Even having names on
Yeah.
papers. I mean, there's studies done that they submit the same paper under different names.
Job application.
Like
was
job
gonna say,
application,
That is why
everything.
you all get to meet me as Laurabel. Because any other name would have a little bit of a question as to what am I walking into. Because I'm Nigerian by birth and I was born with cultural names that mean more to me than anything ever would. And it took till second year of university till I felt comfortable answering to Laurabel because I did not resonate with that name. I have now built it to encompass all of who I am. But for the most of the people who know me in settings that are not always professional, know me as Ifanaya. That is what my parents gave birth to. That is who went through elementary school, high school, and started university. But that is not whoever has applied for a job and gotten it. But Anne, I'd like to question and ask you how you felt you've been an ally, if you have been, and if you haven't, what has prevented you before we go?
Okay, first of all, I certainly am positionally, like internally.
Yeah.
I'm in a learning process of how best to externalize that, as in some of the questions I asked you earlier. I do a lot of reading of the work of Black authors on a like everything from fiction, which can be really informative anyway, because you get inside somebody's head,
Yes.
right? So there's all that. And like in my work with the Social Justice Co-op, I'm always adjacently with a very diverse group of people. And the best way sometimes to get to know and understand people is just be with them. I know that Anti-Racism NL has a Facebook page where there's always suggested reading and stuff. And I just find that a really rich way of learning myself personally.
I want to thank you guys. One, this was not a comfortable situation for you guys, I can assume. But
Oh, it was okay.
well, I'm glad, George.
I got white privilege. Yeah, privilege. That's fine.
You did fine. But I want to thank you for being vulnerable and being open to having these conversations. And then the one request I have for you is that you don't leave this conversation here and walk off and say that's the end. As you go home to your spaces, to the people you love and the people you deal with every day, have these conversations, because we won't always be in the positions.
Talk about it. I mean, you gotta start somewhere.
So
let's
like,
talk about it, you know?
it happens in spaces where it's
Yeah.
predominantly white people, so be the voice when we're not in those spaces to advocate for ourselves.
Exactly.
That's what we ask.